Welcome everyone to the August 20th, 2024 meeting of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Committee. We do have a quorum, and let me call the roll to start. Court Booth.
Present.
Carl Seidman.
Present.
Gary Kleiman.
Present.
And newly appointed Pam Rockwell.
Present.
And Paul Bohm. So we do have a quorum. All of our other members are either on vacation or doing other things, and we will catch up with them on September 3rd, which will be our next meeting. There's nothing tremendously urgent on the agenda here, but this is a bit of a catch-up meeting, continuation meeting. And I know that Gary, you'll be passing the torch to Rich for the next meeting. So we had originally talked about a vote on recommendations, which got turned into sort of a straw man poll in court's recommendations. So tonight we'll be discussing sort of what kind of recommendations we could make, and then maybe on the third, just get a sense of where everybody is. So let's call that a straw man. So that'll happen on the 3rd. For tonight, let me just share my screen here. Yeah. So I want to approve the minutes of July 30th, and then just briefly go over the status of the report, review sort of how the pieces are going to flow, because there was some confusion on that. And then and this is all in your meeting package, to kind of revive so the discussion of what our recommendations might look like, what are the various options, discussing of any outstanding issues. And there actually is one that on the not so much outstanding, but more information on the septic system that exists on the site. Pam has some additional information on that, and we'll talk about that. And then public comments, and then we will adjourn. So first, on the minutes of July 30th, hopefully you've had a chance to review it. Any comments, questions, revisions, edits?
I noticed my name's misspelled on the first paragraph on the second page of the minutes. To just reverse the I and the E.
So I wanted to point out, Paul, that there were some
Yeah.
questions, since I hadn't been sworn in yet, that maybe I can't vote on things. Do we need a form to vote on the minutes?
No, I mean,
Okay.
my understanding is if you have been appointed a member of the committee, you are allowed to vote on the minutes. If you were present at a meeting, or if you were not present at a meeting, a committee member is allowed to vote on the minutes. It doesn't matter. You don't have to abstain. A lot of people prefer to abstain, but if you are a duly appointed member of the committee, you can vote.
Okay.
That's exactly true. So you can vote. So are there any, I'm sorry about the typo. I should have got that in reviewing it.
No problem.
Any other comments on the minutes? Okay.
I move that we accept the minutes of July 30, 2024 as amended with the correct spelling of Carl's name.
I'll second that.
Okay.
There was one word, the word report, which looked like it was a typo. It's just a minor thing if we want to clean it up. When you were showing us the doc, let's see where it is. I know it's silly and minor.
No. You want to get these correct.
Where was it?
Oh, here it is, right here.
You found it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Roping suggested that the report was an E missing, I think.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Instead of an E.
Good catch. Okay. So let's take a vote with those two amendments. Court?
Aye.
Carl?
Aye.
Pam?
Aye.
Gary?
Aye.
And Paul? Aye. And the minutes are approved as amended. Thank you very much. So let me take it off share. Well, on the status of the report. So Just the outline remains as is, and I think I wanted to discuss two things. One is the overall process. So what we're trying to do in this, I'll call this initial review and editing stage, not the final editing, is to have these sections as drafted come into Chris and myself. I review them. I'll send them back out to the authors for consideration of my revisions, at which point then that revised version, even if it's not final, gets sent out by Chris to the entire task force. So I think to date there is one of those that has gone out. That should be the institutional control management plan. You probably should all have that. The second one, which is about to be sent to you, which is back in Carl's hands momentarily, is the ownership section. I forget the number, 10 maybe. The third section, which has been submitted just recently, is Gary's and Rich's section on reuse, which I'm just getting around to taking a look at. So those are the three in the hopper, and that will be the process. Once the task force sees those sections, getting their comments and edits back to Chris and myself, and then those edit suggestions will be incorporated. If they're not, if there's some question about those, if there's some substantial question, I'll keep those as notes and send them back out for kind of final consideration. So it's going to two passes at revisions and edits, and then we'll get to final, and then it'll go, and then it'll probably wait until we have the whole document. As we get more sections, I and others will be able to see the interactions between sections that we're seeing now, the redundancy where it's appropriate and redundancy where it might not be. And so I think after this process, we'll have a fully drafted document, which again will be sent out to the whole task force. At that point, I'm going to talk to Matt at Skio about helping with the final editing, the production, the graphics. I haven't spoken to him yet. And the timing on all that. So the drafts I had asked for by September 1st. I think I heard from Kurt and David, because neither of them are here, that now that the RU report is final, and you all have copies of that report. I don't know if it's made it to the task force website yet, but that report is final. It has a huge amount of appendices, like, but the basic report you should have. So they'll be drafting that section, which will take that report, interpret it, and relate it to other sections of the report, especially the reuse section. So that is now in the works, and I understand from Court and Pam that you've been working on that on the legal section for a while.
Yeah, we have. We're probably 2/3 of the way through. We're pausing to clean up all of our formatting, and then we're going to go back to content. Pam's got family responsibilities right now. She's up in Vermont, but we're back at it this weekend and next week. So next week it'll get finished up and in your hands.
Okay, that's great. And looking at the, let me go back to the share here, looking at the outline. So I am beginning to draft this first section, and Pam is going to help me. I'm going to draft and get to Pam. We'll fill in the blanks, and this should be ready certainly by September 1st and in this case, I'll probably go directly, since I will have seen it, go directly out via Chris to everybody else. We just talked about the legal section. The human health and risk section is underway. We have the reuse section. We have the ownership section. I don't know what the status is. Maybe you do, Pam, of the, I know this has been written up. I don't know if it's been written up into a sort of report
So,
section version.
There was like
10.
a 10-page report that went to the committee before. I think that doesn't belong in our main report. That belongs in an appendix, because it's got all the details about all the sites. I wrote up a review of something that's only 5 pages, that's really tight, probably too tight, and I did actually send it to you. And I sent it to Carl too, And I added some stuff about the StarMet site, the site visit that we did. And so I actually had a question about that,
Okay,
about whether anybody is including in their process and whether this is in the in Gary's section, basically, Gary. So we did a site visit when we first started the committee that was with the 2229 Oversight Committee. And that's actually one of the things in the charge is to interact with the oversight, to meet with the Oversight Committee and learn about the site. And so I put that in the site survey section too. But if that's somewhere else, then I'm happy to take it out.
It's not in our section. We just wrote about our methodology and our findings. You know, a little bit on unique aspects of the site and a little bit on uncertainty.
Some of that I may have written about in this too, so it may be duplicated.
I think I had thought that sort of that input might go into 2B as far as background on, you know, the remediation history, status, and timing.
Okay.
You could
Right.
probably put it in there because I think that would be, we'd want you as a member of that other committee to kind of put in, you know, the status of the remediation.
It
And
could
the
also
time.
go into 3, general approach to task force work and areas of investigation.
Say it again.
It,
What'd you say, Carl?
he thought it could go into 3 as well. And I think the site visits should go in, you know, but I think the details of the remediation, where it stands, a
that
concise
would-
summary of that should probably go here. It's background to the report. You know,
So if you could look at that survey section that you have and cut the parts out of that you want to put in those other sections, Paul, then I
okay.
can fill out that survey section a little more if you think it's incomplete. My goal was to not try to spend 10 pages writing about all the different sites, but to say, we have this group of sites that are a lot like us. We have this group of sites that are these multi owner sites that have some good lessons from them. And then we have a couple of sites that are warnings about what could happen. And I can trim, you know, and if you want that site that piece fleshed out, could you let me know sooner than later?
I will. Let me take a look at.
Okay.
I think the sections I have thus far, although I haven't looked at the review section in detail, have been pretty tight. So it sounds like a sort of a 5-page version of that for this report. Sounds about the right length.
Well, if I cut out the parts that you want to move to other sections, then it's going to be about 3.5 pages, maybe.
Right.
See,
Okay.
I think it should be like 1 page, like just what are the findings? I think a 5 to 10 page annex sounds great. Like, what did we learn in talking to all these other towns? But I feel like here, what you want is just a 1-page summary of what is all of the takeaway. That like some towns have done this, some towns have done that, and what are the lessons that are applicable?
I'm not sure I can do it in 1, but I can definitely do it in 2.
I do think the context of the different types of sites, some discussion of the different context is kind of helpful there.
Yeah, 2 pages sounds good.
Yeah, I think brevity is preferred, but substance, we can't sacrifice substance for that. Anyway, I mean,
So
this is why
Paul, I will divide that
Yeah, fine.
thing up into what Carl had in mind for the survey section and
Okay.
into the things that I thought might go in the other section that you can just cut and paste into when you get to doing the other sections.
Okay.
Does that sound
Yeah.
sensible?
Yeah, just, you know, so on the other sections, so the section 11 is going to be some version of the decision criteria matrix that we talked about. I'll be summarizing that, probably not put in a matrix form, but you know, that we've considered these criteria. I think we are discussing what the possible outcomes could be, you know, what our recommendations could be, and the options. I think 12 and 13 will probably be combined. We will then, when we decide what we're going to do, have a recommendation section. This section has been drafted. I haven't caught up with David on the risk communication. This should be risk communication plan, because what we're having here basically, okay, we're going to make the recommendations, and what are we then suggesting that the select board do? If our recommendation is, we probably will have the institutional control section anyway, no matter what the recommendation is. The risk communication will probably, we'll need to have that. It may have a different context if our recommendation is don't acquire the site. But I do think since the site is in town, I think risk communication is going to be important, whether we recommend the select board to acquire it or not. And then this last section will be, okay, based on the recommendations, what are the logical next steps that we suggest the select board undertake and what the timing would be. So these are all to be fleshed out. I'm focusing right now on sort of major sections 1 and 2 on here, and it sounds like we're in pretty good shape. Any questions or comments sort of on the whole process? It's a little bit clunky and maybe cumbersome, but I think I want to make sure everybody gets to review the early versions, the compiled version, and that we don't violate open meeting law in doing that. Okay, so good. That's item number 2. Item number 3, discussion of possible recommendations. So this is a slightly different version of what I had put before you before. And I would just like to lay out what are the different recommendations that we could make. I was a little bit more detailed. So that overall, basically I'm saying here there's a conditional acquisition recommendation. I don't think anybody's considering, we would not consider a recommendation that says we recommend that the select board acquire the site. They would all be, if we make that recommendation, it would be conditions. And so here are the various conditions which kind of step into next steps. And let me just kind of read so that's conditional acquisition. Second major type of recommendations, this no decision. We don't take or no action. We basically we tell the select board our recommendation is not to take any action, that they wait and wait until it's cleaned up, and they wait until the townwide planning is done, and we wait until the additional information on costs and uses are known. Basically, we don't start negotiations. The select board doesn't start negotiations till at some future date, and the SWARU is probably 2027. So this would basically be saying select board just defer any action, any involvement of town council until that time. At the same time, this suggests that there's some townwide planning with MCI Concord, Peabody, et cetera, at which point the select board and the town would know what's going to happen at this site. So that's sort of a deferred, it's no action. It's actually a deferred action as opposed to no action. So this is a little bit misstated. The last one is don't acquire. For some reason, we find in our legal work, in our risk work, in our examination of uses that the select board should pass on this and allow for the ownership by others, and perhaps down the road that the town would be able to negotiate with a private owner as part of a zoning process or some other process yet to be determined. That this basically the town passes, we allow the site to be acquired by others, we track that whole process, but we're not engaged. The town is not engaged in that process. So for me, those are the 3 types of buckets. And then I have a lot of sub buckets here. So I'll just stop on the major buckets. Are there any sort of major buckets other than conditional acquisition, deferred action, and don't acquire? Anything, any other there was a suggestion that the task force doesn't make any recommendation at all. We, uh, I think we heard from Terry that that was not, that wasn't consistent with our charge. So I'm gonna take that off the table for the moment.
Can I actually respond to that? Because
Sure.
I feel like I did come down a little hard on you last time. I wanted to say, I really appreciate that you've gone through all the time and effort to lay this out. I think this is a great set of options. And while I'm not really advocating that we don't make a decision, what I was trying to convey that I perhaps inarticulately conveyed is that while I think this is a super useful framework or rubric for thinking through potential options, I feel like the decision is actually going to fall out of the text. I think we should focus our efforts now on writing the report, allowing the whole committee to review the chunks of the report. I think once we all see the hard work that Court and Pam have put into investigating the legal issues, once everybody sees the, context around the risk assessment that's been done, once folks see the context around the various reuse options and the ownership options that the other work streams have been working on, I don't think it'll be very hard for us to select from these options, but it is super useful that you put together this rubric for us. I just wouldn't spend a lot of time worrying about how we're going to come to a conclusion, because I think, just like the survey you did, where we all kind of like wrote down, can we answer this question or that question? I think we're going to be more aligned than.
I think so. I didn't want to prejudge that, and sort of this in the text. I want to tell the select board we considered, we considered several different types of recommendations, but based on the text, based on research, we've decided on whatever the recommendation is, and I didn't want to infer that we didn't consider that from the get-go that we said, this is a no-brainer. So I want to kind of be a little transparent that we started out with a almost a clean slate. We ended up, as you said, we're going to end up in a good place, and I think we'll end up with a consensus. But
similarly, I think it's hard for me to like prejudge what will be the specific conditions now, because I haven't read Pam and Court's section yet. So for me, this is adequate for us to go into writing the report, and then we may tweak some of this after we read what they've learned.
And that's I agree with you completely. And that was the sole purpose of just, these are still preliminary. These are all thoughts that just hold on for a second, Carl and Court. Conditional recommend. We've already talked that we have to enter negotiations, right? That until we find out that we can negotiate properly. So the first one is pretty simple: direct the town to enter negotiations. But this first one, we know that we can't do that without the select board expressing specific intent. We've been told that. So this is kind of the simple version. The second version is, well, okay, we do that, but we also at the same time in parallel begin development planning in parallel, as opposed to putting that off. So that when the time comes to make a final decision, we have the planning in place. The third one is all the above, but a little bit more complicated. This is where we would tell the select board to consider approaching a third party or developing a third party for site development. But anyway, this is just, we may not end up with any one of these. We may mix and match, but if we do come up with a recommendation to acquire, it will have some conditions for sure. We'll have to decide on what those are going to be. Court first.
Yeah, just a couple of brief comments. I agree with Gary. I find this very useful. Similarly, I agree with him that as useful as it still would serve us well to not write our respective reports to this document. And I'm not suggesting that you implied we should do that. You didn't, but rather to keep our work quote unquote pure,
Yep.
put this aside and just follow our own charge in the 4 threads, I think is wise advice. And so tell me if I understand you correctly, Gary, but I think I did, and I thought what you said was very clear. And then finally, if I look at A, B, and C, number 1, what I'm seeing is an increasingly directive set of recommendations. And I'm not going to weigh in on whether that's good or bad. I don't know yet, but that is what I'm looking at here, and I understand it, and it makes sense. Whether
Right.
it stand up at the end of the day, none of us know yet.
It may be too directive. It may move beyond the recommendation to sort of suggesting next steps. So, yeah, I agree.
The only other point I'll make, Paul, if I might, is one thing that Pam and I are keen on. I think you've all heard this before. Is if there is any activity on the part of town council, we want it done in such a way that it is very orderly, very known, very clear milestones, so that there are exit ramps as we go along that are the right exit ramps if things do not go the town's way in the estimation of the select board. It's got to be easy for them to know where they stand, because these negotiations are not going to be quick or easy.
Yeah. Do you think on that point, do you think that's something that would go into a section on next steps, or would that be something that would flow out of Mina's work independent of our work?
I think we can have a go at it, and we'll tease it out in our report, and then collectively we can decide if we move it toward next steps.
Yeah, okay. Because I don't know exactly, maybe you know better than I do. I don't know exactly what the when you sit down for negotiations, there's steps. What do you talk about first? What, where do you want to end up, and how do you get there? And there's a strategy for doing that, which
Well,
which has off ramps. Yeah.
Yeah, a simple example is how important do we think a potential 9.7 Citizens Bank liability is? And how important does the select board consider that in the bigger picture of the costs that would be involved? Meaning, that's a simple one to identify and say, where do we put it in the pecking order?
Yep. Agree. And thinking out loud here, I'm wondering. I mean, the end of our process here, we submit a report to the select board. It may be a draft of the select board. We may have discussions with the select board. We may get some guidance from them on that, which they may or may not want to put in the report. I think they probably would not want to put that in the report because it feels like negotiation strategy. But I don't know. That's a perfect off ramp. As are the negotiation for the liens, or the conditions of negotiating the release of those liens. They may be acceptable, but they may not. So that's another clear off ramp. But good. Carl.
Yeah, actually, this last discussion suggests there might be a side memo or something related to negotiations that we might want to offer to the select board, and perhaps thinking about a strategy around which issues to resolve in what order, or what decisions the select board should make around what's acceptable or not. I don't know, it's just something to think about, given at least the work, on the legal side that's been done, and the liability options. But I raised my hand more about this, and I know this is kind of nitpicking here a little bit, but under C, where you call out this 4th item, approach private parties to gauge interest in developing part of the site. I just wonder why that needs to be called out. In some sense, that would be part of a development planning process. You might do that as part of development plan, and it might get misconstrued by the public if it's that there is an intention or some use in mind or something. So I don't know. It's just that one seemed like it's unnecessary.
It may be, and the reason why it's in there is sort of the revenue generation part of this. If that is a concern, I know some of the select board members and FinCom certainly would like to know, maybe in advance of a final decision, not in advance of negotiation, but in advance of a final decision, can this site generate revenues given given the costs of developing the site? So that's why it's in there. It's sort of can we answer, at least in a preliminary sense, a revenue generation question? So, okay, we can leave it at that. Really, thank you for your comments. I think you all hit it on the head that this is not, we should not write the report to this. And I do believe that based on what we have done and what we're all going to read, we will be able to pick one pathway here and one recommendation pathway. I think the next steps and what you suggested about negotiation steps and off ramps may be a little thorny without Mina's input, and maybe we want Mina's input for that section. We'll have to discuss that with Megan and Chris and others to see whether we want to engage him in that level of sort of, I'll call it part of the conditions. I don't know, Court.
Yeah, my best sense about it, this is up to Megan and Chris, but my best sense is we are going to be hard put to go to the well with Mina Macarius much more before this report hits the select board. But if it's critical, I guess they'll try to find a way for us. But it's not, he's not a phone call away. We've got to work through Chris and Megan.
Yep. Okay, Pam.
So I wanted to say that I wanted to try to understand that we're suggesting that we might have some private meeting and private memo that we give to the select board that's a memo about negotiation strategy that would not be part of the main report. Is that what was suggested for potentially for those kind of things where we don't want to be disclosing negotiation strategy, but we have an opinion about that?
I don't want to take that off the table. That would be an executive session of this committee, which might precede the report submission or may occur, as part of the report review and discussion. I don't want to take it off the table, but I don't think we certainly haven't come close to deciding whether that's appropriate.
Okay.
Okay. Good. And, we're going to revisit these as we move along. So there's one remaining issue, and that's kind of outstanding issues. And to that end, the Pam has unearthed some information on the septic system. So one of the questions that we had and that Carl was exploring and Megan was exploring was whether as part of the development of the site that a septic system could be installed. And of course, we decided right away, well, we don't know what the site can be used for, so we can't specify where and the capacity of that system. But we got some early information from EPA that given soil characteristics, given what they understand the cleanup, they didn't think there'd be any problem of installing a septic system. The size of that system and the approvals of that system are yet to be determined. And because it's at a certain size, I think whether it's 10,000 gallons a day, it's beyond the town's approval. So those are real details that I don't think we need to engage in our report. I think what we need to engage in our report is we've looked at the site, we've spoken to people, it can accommodate a septic system. The exact details need to be determined.
But I think we might want to say something about what size system it can be accommodated, just so we have limits,
Yeah, yeah, that'll be
if we know that.
beneficial.
I don't think we
So-
do, because, I mean, you could you could bring in soil to create the conditions for a larger system. I mean, it's not, there's nothing inherent, I think, in the site that constrain, I mean, obviously, constrains a system.
Well,
And I think
I guess what I'm getting at is like, maybe within the, you haven't read our section yet, but what Rich and I have put together is, some scenarios that suggest here's a mix and match of a few different types of uses that would make sense together. And it would be nice, I think, if we could say septic is feasible for those uses or combinations of uses, or septic is feasible for about half of those combinations of uses. If it's a hard constraint, and we know that already, it's not worth putting out these scenarios. If we know it's not a hard constraint, I think it's worth saying that.
well, I don't think we're going to be able to do the research, or that it's even really our charge to do that. I think in any further reuse planning, that will have to be addressed. I just don't think it's within our scope, and I don't think we're going to be able to do the analysis to make a statement of that nature.
but
But-
I don't disagree with it, but my sense, Gary, having talked to a few people, the town and EPA, is that this site is large enough and the soils will be clean enough and deep enough that it could accommodate a large system. And the only constraint will be on how it's permitted, whether the town can, and, I think we have to flesh that out a little bit.
Exactly.
Uh,
So
yeah.
I think what you're saying and what Carl are saying are two ends of a spectrum, and I think we need to flesh out where we are in there. I mean, Carl, are you comfortable saying that the site is large enough, the soils are good quality?
Yeah, I mean, and even if you ended up testing all the soils, and the best place to put the site, the soils didn't match, you could bring in soil.
Right.
That is, and in fact, one of the advantages of doing planning earlier and figuring out where you want to put the septic system is that then you could perhaps have the Maximus in when they bring in new soil, solve that problem for you if it is a problem. So, but
So that's
yeah,
that's all I'm looking for, is I think we need to negotiate a statement with language that we're all comfortable with.
So,
Agreed.
Carl, when you did the estimates of how much stuff would cost, you based it on the linear footage of things, and there was septic in there, wasn't it?
what I did was I had figures from a private developer that included a septic system. And then the figures I had for estimates the town gave me didn't have septic, and I added a overly large number there to potentially cover septic.
But the private development one was functionally what Gary is describing as the most heavily used part of the potential reuse scenarios, right?
It wasn't an incredibly, I don't know, it was a multi-house subdivision, maybe 20 or
Oh,
so.
okay.
It wasn't,
It wasn't a giant house.
Well, that remains an outstanding issue, which I think we can kind of conquer and get in the report. But I think what's interesting is perhaps you've found out that there is a septic system on the site, and Pam has gone and we were alerted to this, I think, at the last site meeting, because Bruce was talking about it, because they were examining it, investigating it, and dealing with it. So Pam, why don't you go through this, and tell me what the flip.
Okay, so go ahead and flip to the next slide. So basically, there was an old septic system that was built in 1982 at the time that Building E was added. This was not a Title V system. This was just part of the special permit that they got for Building E. Bruce has copies of diagrams of this, so that are the town part of the town building permit, but we haven't been able to locate that. Melanie hasn't been able to locate them in our town files, so we're not sure where he got them. We think they're from the investigation during the RIFS over a decade ago. This is located under the lower parking lot between the Cooling Pond Bog area and the Main Street area, very close to the wetlands. At the time that the NSRC was considering options, it was expected that this area would become inaccessible because of the work on the Gabion Wall, which the septic system is very close to, and that they would be removing the parking lot and restoring the area as natural. But at this site visit that we went to a week and a half ago, Bruce mentioned, oh no, this septic system is clean, and he acted like he knew how big it was. So I had a further conversation with him, and he said that if the septic tanks are not contaminated, they have no obligation or requirement to review them. The upper 3 courses of the Gabion Wall will come off, and they are not planning on restoring it. But they did not believe that it needed to be restored in order to reuse the septic system and distribution system. So can you go ahead to the next slide? So I have the diagrams that he gave me, which are from the town. I have information from our reuse report, which is the aerial photo of the site, the diagrams of the reusable areas, the topo map on that site, and the technical specs of the septic system, which is also one of the things that Bruce gave me. So if you want to go through to the next one.
And what we're going to see, this was a system that was permitted by the town, but it was not a Title V.
It's not a
Permit.
system that was permitted by the town. It was a building plan permitted by the town, a building permit for the town. So
Is
it
that-
wasn't like it would go to the health department for review back then because there
Got it.
wasn't Title V.
Right, that's what I was saying. So basically it was part of the building permit, but it's a different process now. Okay.
So this is the little key to the plan so that you can get an idea that that's the area that you're going to see a bigger diagram of in there. It's the lower parking lot. If you went to the site visit, the very first site visit, we walked across the Gabion Wall, we walked around the outside there, and then we walked back on the pathway between the bog and the cooling pond. Can you move to the next one? So I don't know if you can see that, but I'm pointing out which things are cooling pond, which things are holding basin, and which things are bog. And that's Route 62, the road along the top. Do you want to go to the next one? So this is the building plan. There, if you look at the topo area, that the yellow line is where the pipe is coming from the building E or from the site. That's supposed to be the septic tank there. That's according to this diagram. This is sort of almost at the base of the Gabion Wall, and then the pipe goes across the Gabion Wall. Actually, Bruce describes this as going behind the Gabion Wall. And then those are the leaching fields under the parking lots down there. So I'll have to say that when we were looking at this for the reuse committee, I was under the impression that the tank was over on the right-hand side with the leaching fields and not on the other side. So I'm not actually sure which areas of this need to be removed and which are uncontaminated. Can you move to the next picture? So that's a close-up of that, the Gabion Wall there, with the septic tank on the left-hand side and the leaching fields on the right-hand side. Okay, next one.
Well, let me before that, of course, there are many questions about this. First of all, this is part of the building plan. It's not exactly clear if this is actually what was built. I think
That's right.
they believe it is, but you see leaching area typical. I believe that Bruce has investigated the tank and has found that quote unquote uncontaminated. So they don't intend to remove that. I don't know, Pam, what the status of the leaching fields are going to be, but in any event, it's not at all clear that it's a usable system, but it is indicative that there was a system that operated at the site. I mean, I'm not sure we can say much more than that.
This did operate at the site, and previously there was one that operated at the site where there were floors were swept into the septic system, and that was stopped about the time the holding basin discharges were stopped. And That's, I think, because they started using this septic system. I'm not sure whether they use this septic system for the whole site. So this is the overhead, so you can get a sense of where this is. That's the cooling pond there that you see, not the holding basin. And that's the road that connects the top parking lots on your left from the lower parking lot where the, on your right, where the
We-
leaching fields are below the parking lot. The sort of scrubby area in the lower right-hand corner, that is the sphagnum bog. So you want to go to the next one? So this is the areas that were designated by the reuse committee. When the reuse committee looked at the septic system in this area, we basically looked at the fact that the whole septic system and leaching field are in areas that are wetlands and protected. So in addition to the fact that there's no Title V ability for this, this is an area where the NRC would not want to put a new septic system, and the Board of Health would not want to put a new septic system. The placement of it makes it inappropriate for that. There is some possibility that we could take advantage of the fact that it's grandfathered in because it exists, but it hasn't been in actual operation since the buildings have been removed. So there would be some question about that, and we're not actually sure how big it is.
Yeah. And it's
So-
sitting on a saddle here. So you go down here pretty steeply and you go down on this side very steeply. So
Can I just say, from an NRC perspective, I
Mhm.
don't think that you would be able to reuse the system, but the point seems to be that it's likely to be left in place. And since that area, well, all right, we won't go into reuse, but
Yeah.
I think what we've talked about is that area sort of remaining natural anyway. So if it's
Well,
being
we're
left
not-
in place, it's just really a matter of knowing where it is and
So my understanding is that the parking lot is gonna have to get dug up and restored natural anyway. So I'm not sure what gets left in place and what
yeah,
doesn't.
well, that's up to Bruce.
And Kara is on vacation until or after our next meeting, so
Okay.
I don't know whether we're gonna get an answer from EPA or just from the contractors. You want to keep going? So again, this is a close-up of that area. This is really environmentally unfriendly for putting a septic system in. This is something that never would have been approved if they tried to put it in 1995 instead of 1982.
Right, it's
Yeah, keep
definitely within
going.
25 or 50 feet of wetland.
Yeah, and so that's just the topo map of the area, so you can get a sense of that. That's the saddle that we're talking about there.
Yeah.
And keep going. That is the only diagram we have of what might actually be in the ground where the septic tank is, and it does not have dimensions on it. It has some part numbers, but we're not sure how big that septic tank is. So that's going to be more discussion to see whether, whether it was even adequate for what they were doing at either. So the questions we have is, is the old septic tank contaminated? Is the old leaching field contaminated? Will there be access to service the septic system after the Gabion wall is remediated? Does this septic system meet the requirements the Board of Health might have for future uses? No, not really. And would the Natural Resources Commission have any objections? Yes, they probably would. So counting on this as a septic system we can use or as a location that we would put a septic system is probably a big no.
Well, and I think any new septic system issues are gonna have to be dealt with in the context of, a more detailed kind of reuse plan and a real site plan that lays out the infrastructure and where it'd be located and all of those things. So it's,
Yeah,
know-
and let me get back out. I mean, so the charge on this matter for this task force, I think we have to come up with a statement that we understand that a septic system, the leaching field, the site can accommodate it. Perhaps we can talk about capacity. We don't know. And that historically there have been the septic system on the site, but it can't be reused. So I think if I'm on the select board, I'd want to know, can we put a septic system here? And I think the answer is yes, but beyond that, I think it's beyond the scope of this committee to kind of deal with that. This finding is interesting. That tank, according to Bruce, will be left. I'm not sure if this leaching field is going to be left, but the tank is going to be left. Can the town use that tank? I'm not sure, but it's going to be left there. That, according to Bruce, they have no intention of digging it up.
Over 40 years old. So,
Yes. Yeah.
It's probably, near the end of its useful life anyway.
It would never be permitted, I'm pretty sure.
And we would want to be sure that the septic is someplace that
Maybe
could be
dig into Andrew's
repaired
old document.
or
Yeah.
replaced in
Yeah.
40, 50 years, if we're going to
Well,
do something like
what
that.
could
And
reasonably
it's probably the last place on the entire site you'd want to put a septic system, other than in the bog properly. It just seems very vulnerable and
then back
at a
to
very strange place.
One advantage is that we do actually have really good details about what the soil types are like in different areas. So if you had a contractor trying to design where to put a septic system, you could actually look at the soils and see which ones are sandy and which ones are porous. The kind of information you need, you would have.
Okay, so I think that's all on that issue, and that's also all on the agenda. I do want, before I open up for public comment, between now and the next meeting, which is September 3rd, if we could get most of the draft sections in, that'd be well on our way to kind of getting things reviewed and starting to get things in place. So I think the timing looks good, and so probably at next meeting, we'll probably review where those things are, and we may want to actually comment on sections that we've all reviewed, because once we've all reviewed them, I think we can exchange comments on those. So with that, any other task force business? Okay, open up for comments. Hi, Kathy.
How you doing?
Anything, any public comments from, I don't know if Terry is with us. Kathy's with us. Megan is somewhere behind the scenes.
Kathy, are you commenting? Or I'll go ahead then.
Go ahead.
So interesting discussions. Thanks Pam for all that detail on the septic. Looks like we'll probably have to rule that out, but it's good to know. And interesting idea about a side letter or a confidential report or appendix for negotiating strategy. I think that might be something to consider. I'm sure it would be useful for the select board. The question would be how logistically it would work with the open meeting law. And I'm sure if you wanted to do it, we could work with council and figure out the appropriate way to do it.
Yeah, it might be no more than an executive session where we kind of discuss that without something in writing. In thinking that through, I'm sure attorneys would have a strategy, but I think from a task force point of view, we might have a slightly different approach or maybe the same approach. So it might be worthwhile comparing notes in an executive session on sort of those next steps and
The problem with the executive session is it would have to get recorded. Like what you want is some document or something for use later by the select board when they're negotiating.
Well, I mean, the minutes of that executive session could include that, that summary.
Okay, maybe we could do it through the minutes. Okay.
Yeah, it's a possibility. Okay, with that, great. Thank you for making the quorum tonight, and keep things moving along. And Pam, welcome to the committee.
Thank you.
I haven't heard anything more from Carrie Flood. I hope she's doing okay.
I haven't heard anything more either. So.
Okay. With that, the meeting is adjourned, and we'll see you on the 3rd of September.